The National. I am easy to find. Dave, y- The National is an interesting band. So it's one of those bands from the aughts, one of those rock bands from the aughts that
Hmm.
are still going. The Killers, Strokes took a break, kind of back together, kind of not. They at least tour every once in a while, or at least do
Dirty
festivals.
projectors.
Dirty Projectors, I guess, are in there, but more like LCD Sound System, I guess, are one of the
Mm.
ones that are holding on. Uh, we talked about other bands on here that I don't think we necessarily need
The
to mention
monkeys.
because they aren't necessarily great. But the National, I think their stock continues to actually at least remain consistent. It hasn't really taken
Mhm.
that dip, and it has actually probably gone up throughout the 2010s. Um, this album, I'm Easy to Find, is their eighth album, and it's also a bit of a departure from what they normally do. They included a lot of guest vocalists, and particularly female guest vocalists, throughout this album, which they hadn't done much of in the past. Um, their last album, Sleep Well Beast, came out 2017. Got a lot of, I would say, acclaim for using more electronic sounds in it, which is not a typical National way of making music. But I think the word that describes them is consistent, which I think can also kind of be synonymous with boring sometimes with rock
Yeah.
music. I'm wondering for you, a pretty critical rock ear, only liking very specific rock like Greta Van Fleet,
Ugh,
those excellent rockers from Michigan.
hard
Did
rock.
you find this National album boring?
Um, I didn't like it nearly as much as their first record, their debut album, which I mean, 8 album gap. It's reasonable to expect they'll sound different. So
Right.
not really holding it against them, not negative, but um, yeah, I think the first track, you had your soul with you.
Mm-hmm.
It they mixed it so it would go in and out each ear in the beginning for a good 10 seconds, and it was actually mixed in such a cool way that I actually thought my Bluetooth was like barely connecting and bugging out until I picked up that it was actually the way it was supposed to sound.
Mm-hmm.
um and that song kind of reminded me of some of the older stuff I had heard that was, I don't want to say the guitars were harder, but it was the more, I think, the louder
Mm-hmm.
side of their sound. And just even though the vocals are always pretty mellow, pretty down the middle, the beats, the rhythm of the music is still pretty upbeat and a little hard at times, and that's what I can connect to. But the back half of this album, after the first few tracks, started to lose me just because the lead singer is kind of just gonna warble a little bit. It doesn't really grab me that much. But I'm also not like well versed in their music or their sound. I mean, what is your like? You mentioned that they recently use electronic music in their last record. That's something that a lot of rock bands have almost felt forced to do to stay relevant, to make their music listenable in the modern age. But do you think they kept that going, or they almost went back to what they used to do? Because I mean, you kept saying that they're consistent. So do you think they're reluctant to change anymore, or they're just kind of sticking into what they're good at, and that's okay? Like, what's your overall take on 8 albums in?
I actually think this is one of the most the biggest changes they've had in terms of conceptualizing an album. Matt, you mentioned the lead singer Matt Berninger. Uh, he really is, for like most rock bands, the heartbeat of the band. He writes almost all the lyrics. He has this very like Leonard Cohen, Nick Cave type vibe to him, where he has this kind of like deep, sultry type voice that can really be moving, and he can make almost like the most mundane topics in songs still seem
Hmm.
pretty interesting. And there's definitely some mundane topics within here. I think there's actually a song, I can't remember which one, where he just talks about like a couple who, they still really love each other, but they just really aren't like as into each other as they used to be, and they're like, oh well, we're too invested to like move forward, move on from this, so we're just gonna kind of stay in it. It's like, oh, it's a really boring topic for a song, very like everyday life type thing, but somehow he still makes it sound good. I And what they did was, he brought his wife in and she helped him write some of the lyrics. And they made this almost like a conversational album in a lot of ways. And that's why bringing in guest vocalists like Sharon Von Etten, whose
Mm.
album we talked about earlier in the year, Lisa Thompson, Kate Stables, or Gail and Dorsey, who is David Bowie's longtime bassist, really adds like something to this album that not many other national albums have. And I would actually say that that makes this probably one of their most inventive albums. And it's risk taking, but in a safe way for them, because Berninger is still the heartbeat of this, and he's still the driving force. And I think songs like Light Years, which I tweeted about, I think is probably one of the most beautiful songs I've heard this year. Is when the Nationals at their best, when they're writing very simple but succinct and moving lyrics, and they're kind of relying on what they normally do, but taking chances and letting other people have a voice on this record, I think, is a sign of them trying something and trying to I don't know, shape themselves as a band moving forward.
Shout out Aaron Dessner for curating Boston Calling. Frankly, that's
Yeah.
the most recent time I felt like the National was truly in the news for me, was their affiliation,
Hmm.
uh, you know, professionally and overratedly, I guess, with the festival. I don't know. It's interesting. Um, yeah, I feel like they're just one of these well-established bands that just have a really big fan base, and they're just cool to just kind of go off to the beat of their own drum. I mean, I was just reading they recorded this at Long Pond Studio, which is like an hour north of where I'm from in the Hudson Valley. Not
Uh,
exactly the studio you think a mainstream international music act would go to record, but they don't have to worry about that kind of thing,
no.
So they can just do whatever.
Yeah, the National, I think, are I think consistent is a good word for them, and I wouldn't say that necessarily they're boring, but I do think you can kind of uh, find similarities, especially in their earlier albums, that you could say, yeah, well, maybe they weren't trying to go too far out, but recently they've been taking more risks. So I applaud them for that. We already added Light Years to our playlist, but you should follow that playlist, Nowstalgia Best of 2019, on Spotify. Give us that follow and stay up to date on all the music we like.